Clara was at the flea market, her hands running over the tables of old and curious items. Then her eyes fixed on a mirror. A distorted reflection caught her attention. She picked up the mirror and felt a shiver, yet she couldn't resist. It was as if the mirror had a mysterious power over her. Looking closer, she noticed something strange reflected in it. Dark and distorted figures, as if the mirror were trapped in another world. She tried to look away, but the mirror seemed to be calling her, an invisible force pulling her gaze more and more. The mirror seemed to expand before her eyes, and Clara felt a sense of falling, as if she were being swallowed by the reflection itself. Not understanding what was happening, she saw a huge shadow form inside the mirror, a demonic figure staring at her with empty eyes. The mirror was now completely distorting. Clara couldn't move anymore. Her feet were glued to the floor, as if the mirror had the power to control her body. The shadow in the mirror moved toward her, and Clara realized with a terrible shock that it wouldn't be her controlling the fate, but the evil reflection before her. A sensation of paralysis took over her body as the reflection of the creature inside the mirror approached, showing sharp claws and a mouth thirsty for souls. She screamed, but the sound didn't escape her mouth. All she could do was stare at the reflection, feeling the weight of the demonic presence drawing nearer, with no way to escape. Clara felt an invisible force grab her wrists, pulling her into the mirror. Her eyes widened in horror as her hands passed through the cold, dark glass, as if it were a dense liquid. She tried to resist, kicking and struggling, but the force was relentless. Her entire body was swallowed by the mirror, and a cold shiver ran down her spine as darkness enveloped her. On the other side, Clara fell onto a cold stone floor. The environment was a vast, dimly lit corridor, with walls covered in old, dusty mirrors. Her reflection did not appear in any of them. She stood up trembling and touched one of the mirrors. A dark mark spread where her hand touched, as if something on the other side was trying to reach her. Suddenly, one of the mirrors shattered into shards, and a glowing-eyed creature emerged. It had no face, only a mouthful of sharp teeth and long, twisted claws. Clara stepped back quickly, her heart racing. The creature let out a guttural scream and began crawling toward her, its claws scraping against the stone floor. In panic, she looked around, searching for an escape. There was an old wooden door at the end of the corridor. Without thinking twice, she ran toward it, feeling the creature getting closer and closer. Clara reached the door and pushed with all her strength, but the wood felt old and sturdy. Behind her, the sound of the creature's claws scraping against the walls echoed down the corridor. In desperation, she pounded frantically on the door, feeling panic take over her body. Finally, with a loud crack, the door opened, and Clara threw herself inside, shutting it quickly. The silence was eerie. The only light came from a flickering candle in the corner of the room, illuminating old furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the room, there was a large oval mirror with a golden frame, dusted by time. Clara approached slowly, hesitant. When she looked into the mirror, her reflection was there, but something felt off. Her movements were slightly delayed, as if the reflection was hesitating before mimicking her. Suddenly, the reflection smiled, but Clara did not. A chill ran down her spine, and she took a step back, gasping. Before she could react, skeletal hands emerged from the shadows behind her and pulled her forcefully into the mirror. Clara fell onto a cold stone floor. When she looked up, she realized she was in a distorted version of the previous room, where the wall seemed to shift slowly as if made of smoke. Whispers began to echo around her, indistinct voices murmuring words she could not understand. Dark figures moved at the edges of her vision. In a panic, she got up and started running down a long hallway which seemed to stretch endlessly. With each step she took, the corridor grew narrower. At the end of the hallway, there was another door. Without hesitation, Clara opened it, only to find herself in a gigantic hall filled with mirrors of various shapes and sizes. As she tried to cross the hall, she noticed that the mirrors reflected different versions of herself. Some looked terrified, others smiled disturbingly. Suddenly, hands began to emerge from the mirrors, trying to grab her. Clara stepped back, but the distorted reflections seemed to be getting closer. The entire hall began to tremble, and a deafening sound echoed as the mirrors started to crack, as if something was trying to break through into the real world. Clara knew she had to find a way out before it was too late. With her heart pounding, she desperately searched for a way to escape. Clara entered the hall, where numerous mirrors of different sizes and shapes were scattered. The environment is dark and oppressive, and the cold stone floor chills her feet. She looked at the mirrors, and her reflections began to move, but not in the same way she did. Clara approached a large oval mirror, and as she did, her reflections began to distort. Her eyes glowed in a sinister way. A chill ran down her spine, and she stepped back, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, the distortions in the mirrors increased, and the reflections began to move independently. Clara looked around, seeing the reflections in the other mirrors, all distorted with expressions of pain and suffering. Some people were burning, others frozen crying, and others extremely thin with visible ribs. A mirror on the opposite wall slowly began to crack, making a sharp. The hall grew even darker, with mirrors cracking and whispers echoing around Clara. She tried to move away, but the reflections began to approach, their hands reaching out as if trying to grab her. Clara screamed, but no sound came from her mouth. She was trapped in a nightmare where the images couldn't be controlled. Skeletal hands began to emerge from one of the mirrors, trying to grab Clara, who quickly stepped back. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble and the room seemed to warp. Clara felt the air become dense and cold, as if she was being swallowed by the darkness. The shadows in the hall seemed to come to life, moving erratically. The reflections began to smile in a distorted way, their eyes glowing with a ghostly light. Clara tried to run, but the mirrors surrounded her, reflecting distorted versions of herself. She stopped in front of a large mirror, and her own image stared back at her with an evil grin. With every movement Clara made, the reflection followed her, but now with a look of pure malice. Clara felt a growing pain in her chest as the hands of the reflections pulled her into the mirror, as if absorbing her. Finally, Clara was pulled into the mirror, and the last sight she had was of her reflection smiling at her in a sinister way. The mirror closed, leaving the silence to take over.